I want to point out something strange about project management careers. Most people trying to break into PM roles are doing exactly what they're told to do. They're learning the terminology, they're taking courses, maybe even getting certified, and yet they keep getting filtered out when it comes to applying for jobs. What's interesting is that it's usually not the least capable people who struggle the most. It's actually the people who are actually smart and know what they're doing. See, the problem isn't intelligence. It's actually that there's a gap between learning and knowing about project management and what companies actually mean when they say they want someone with experience in project management. In this video, I want to break down what that gap really is, why it exists, and why most advice online accidentally makes it worse. Once you notice this, the whole PM career path starts to make a lot more sense, and you start seeing this problem everywhere. Most people trying to become project managers follow the same path, and to be clear, it's a reasonable path. You start by learning what a project manager is supposed to do. You watch videos, you read frameworks, you learn the key language and the key concepts like scope, risk, stakeholders, and timelines. Then you do what logically comes next. You update your resume with this terminology, and then you apply for PM roles. And see, that's where things start to break, because the feedback is almost always the same if you get feedback at all. Oh, we're looking for someone with a bit more experience. See, what's important here is that this isn't a motivation problem or a knowledge problem. It's simply a system problem. The system tells you learn first, then apply. But hiring processes and hiring managers are focused on something completely different. They're focused on people who've already managed and been inside projects. So you end up stuck in this loop where you learn more, you get more certificates, thinking that maybe you're just missing one more thing. And then you tweak your resume and you add more credentials, and then you apply again and you get filtered out again. And what makes this more frustrating is that the system never tells you what kind of experience it actually wants. It just labels everything as experience. Now, I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine there are two candidates. The first one has taken a bunch of courses. Yes, they can explain what a project charter is. They know the definitions. And then there's a second person who has actually been inside of projects. They've seen a charter actually get challenged. They've seen stakeholders disagree. They've actually watched scope get changed on a project. And so when a hiring manager asks, tell me about a project that didn't go as planned, those two candidates answer very differently. See, one answers in theory, the other answers with a logical sequence, what happened, what they did, and why they did it. See, the system doesn't reward you for memorizing theory. It rewards you for real exposure to real projects. And that's why so many capable people feel like they're doing everything right and still not moving forward. So once you realize the problem isn't effort or intelligence, the obvious question becomes, well, what does experience actually mean in project management? Because companies use that word over and over again, but they almost never define it. Most people assume that experience means time. 2 years, 5 years, senior level. But if you've ever worked inside of a real organization, you know that that's not true. Some people have 10 years of experience doing the same thing over and over again. Others have 2 years of experience across 10 different industries in multiple different situations. And in project management, experience isn't just necessarily time, it's also exposure. And that exposure can show up in a few very specific ways. So when a hiring manager says they want experience, they're usually looking for 5 things, even if they themselves don't consciously realize it. First, they're looking for exposure to real workflows, not how projects should move on paper, but how they actually move when people are busy, when information isn't complete, when priorities are changing. Second, they're looking for documentation and artifacts. Have you actually created a charter, a plan, a risk log? Have you actually used those documents to manage a project? And have you seen how those documents evolve over time? And have you used them as tools to make sure that your project doesn't fail? Or have you just seen templates and examples? The third thing they're looking for is decision-making under uncertainty. In real projects, there may not always be a clear answer. And experience shows up in how you choose when there isn't a perfect option available. The fourth is stakeholder communication, not just by sending updates, but by actually navigating through disagreement, through pressure, through misalignment between people and between different incentives and priorities. And then number 5 is pattern recognition. Oh, I've seen something like this before. I think I know what to do here. That's what people mean by experience. A simple way to think about it is this. Learning project management is like learning the rules of a sport. Experience, however, is having played enough games that you don't panic when the clock is running out. You can memorize every rule of basketball, but until you've played, you won't know how it feels when the game is on the line and when your best player gets injured. That's why people can know all the terminology and all the frameworks and have all the credentials on their resume and still freeze up when asked to talk about a real project. Because experience isn't about knowing what should happen, it's about recognizing what is happening or has happened and what you did or how you responded. Now, a lot of people recognize that problem we just talked about, but they try to solve it with more courses and certifications. And I want to be clear up front, courses and certifications are not useless. Yes, they help. They just don't do the job most people think they do. A course is designed to teach you concepts. A certification is designed to test whether you remember those concepts. Neither one is designed to actually put you inside the situations where project managers actually build real confidence. And the reason this becomes obvious is in interviews. Think about how PM interviews are actually structured. They almost never ask, oh, define scope. Oh, what's the difference between a risk and an issue? Instead, they ask things like, tell me about a time when scope changed unexpectedly on your project. Walk me through a project that didn't go as planned. How did you handle conflicting stakeholders? Those aren't knowledge questions. They're prompts to get you talking about what you've done. Someone who's only learned about project management answers those questions with just theory. They explain what should happen. Someone who's been inside projects, however, answers in sequence. They describe what actually happened, what decisions they made, and what they learned from it. That's the difference, and that difference is immediately obvious to the person on the other side of the table. And this is why people often say things like, I know the material, but I just don't feel confident talking about it. That feeling is simply a consequence of only studying project management and not actually doing it. Confidence in interviews doesn't come from knowing more terms. It comes from having seen situations unfold and having had to respond in real time. That's also why people sometimes get certified and then get really excited and feel really proud. And then after a while, when they still don't get a job, they feel like nothing has truly changed. See, the certification didn't fail them. It just wasn't designed to create the kind of experience that interviews are actually testing for. Now, a lot of people describe what they're feeling at this point as imposter syndrome, and sometimes that's true. But in project management, there's another possibility that's worth saying out loud. Sometimes the reason you feel like an imposter is because you actually haven't been exposed to enough real situations yet. That's not a character flaw or a confidence issue, it's just simply a lack of reps. Think about the kinds of things PMs are expected to talk through confidently. Why a decision was made with incomplete information, how a risk was handled when there was no perfect plan, how you dealt with stakeholders who disagreed with you on the project. If you haven't lived through those moments, even in a controlled environment, it makes talking about them feel awkward or forced. You're not nervous because you're bad at project management. You're nervous because you're trying to describe situations you actually haven't lived yet. And that's why motivation or studying won't fix this. Yeah, you can read more, you can rehearse answers, you can scream affirmations in the mirror to boost your confidence, but confidence in this world isn't a mindset that you adopt. It's a byproduct of having been inside real scenarios enough times that your brain stops guessing. Once you've seen scope change a few times, once you've watched a plan fall apart and then get rebuilt on a project, once you've had to explain trade-offs to real people, and once you've had to manage risk and escalate issues, the imposter syndrome feeling fades away on its own. Not because you became more confident, but because you became more familiar with the realities of project management. So if experience comes from exposure, the obvious question is, how do people usually get that exposure? In practice, there are only 3 common ways, and the first one is internal promotion. So you start by working as a coordinator or an analyst or maybe operations, and then over time you slowly take on more responsibility and you start getting exposed to these types of things that project managers do. This can work, but it's often a lot slower and can also depend on timing, managers, and on the needs of the company. And then the second way is that someone takes a chance on you. A hiring manager decides to overlook the experience requirement and hopes you'll figure it out on the job. And this does happen, but also very rare. And when it does happen, it usually comes with a lot of pressure and very little margin for learning. You're expected to just perform immediately, even though you've never been inside this kind of environment before. And then the third way is kind of like unofficial experience, where you lead projects that aren't formally labeled as project management. Yeah, you organize work, you coordinate people, you manage deadlines, just without the official title. This is actually how a lot of good PMs actually start. But again, it still depends on opportunity. You have to be in the right role, on the right team, at the right time to possibly get this type of role. And what all 3 of these paths have in common is something most people don't notice, is that they all require permission. You're waiting for a company or a manager or a situation to allow you to gain experience. And while you're waiting, the experience gap doesn't close. This is why so many people, capable people, feel stuck for years. Not because they're doing nothing, but because the system only offers slow, permission-based paths to actually move forward. Once you realize that waiting for permission is what slows everything down, the problem becomes much simpler. If experience comes from exposure, then the real problem is simply access. Access to how projects run, access to real workflows, access to decisions being made with imperfect information. That's the piece that most people never get until they're hired. But if you think about it, that doesn't really make sense. We don't wait until someone becomes a pilot before they step into a simulator. They step into a simulator, then they become a pilot. They observe, they practice, they make mistakes in a controlled environment, and project management works the same way, or at least I think that it should. When people truly close the experience gap in project management, it almost always follows the same pattern. First, they observe, they watch how real work flows, they see what gets discussed, what gets escalated, and what actually matters. Second, they produce, they create real deliverables like charters, like plans, risk logs, status updates. And they don't just create them once, they manage them and they update them as the reality on the project changes. And then third, they defend, they explain their decisions, they answer questions, and they adjust when required. That's the loop: observe, produce, defend. This is a loop that actually builds judgment, and judgment is what interviews are actually testing for. This is why people who've been inside a real project environment speak differently. They're not guessing what should happen, they're recalling information, they're recalling what actually happened. Once you have access to that kind of environment, the experience gap stops being a mystery, and as you get more reps over time under real constraints, you start thinking, speaking, and acting differently. At this point, the question most people are asking is simple: how do I know if I'm actually ready to start running projects or if I need more exposure? Here's a simple litmus test that you can use right now. If you were sitting in an interview tomorrow, could you calmly walk through these 5 questions? Question number 1, could you explain a project that you worked on, its goals, its constraints, who the key stakeholders were? Number 2, could you walk someone through a project charter that you worked on and explain why it was structured the way it was? Question number 3, can you describe a real risk that showed up on your project, how you discovered it, and what you did about it? Question number 4, can you explain a change request that came in, what changed, who did it impact, and what trade-offs were involved, and how did you handle it? And then question number 5, can you talk through a decision that you made where maybe there wasn't a perfect answer and you have to explain why you chose that path? So if you can answer those 5 questions comfortably, you're probably ready to go into interviews, and those interviews probably are not as intimidating to you. Not because you memorize answers, but because you're actually describing situations you've lived through. And if you can't do those things yet, then that's okay. It doesn't mean you're behind, it just means that you need more exposure. That's the real dividing line. So if we zoom out for a second, the whole experience gap problem becomes a lot less mysterious. First, by realizing that it's not a motivational issue or a personal failure, it's simply a system that filters for people who've already been exposed to real project environments. And second, experience in project management isn't time or credentials. It's actually just exposure to real workflows, to real decisions, and to real trade-offs. And third, the fastest way to close that gap isn't waiting for permission. It's getting access to environments where that kind of exposure actually happens. Once you see it this way, a lot of common advice stops making sense. It's not that courses or certifications are bad, they're just incomplete if they're the only thing that you're relying on. The people who move forward aren't the ones who know the most definitions, they're actually the ones who've been inside enough real situations that they don't have to guess anymore. If you want to keep thinking about this, pay attention to how PMs talk in meetings, how they explain decisions, how they handle uncertainty. That's what experience sounds like. And if you want to stop guessing and actually start building the kind of familiarity, the kind of experience and exposure for yourself, I'm going to leave a link down in the description below where you can actually step into a live project environment and see how this actually works in the real world. Either way, once you understand the experience gap, you stop blaming yourself and start making much better decisions about what to do next. So hey, if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel. It really means a lot, and hope you enjoyed it. If nothing else, I'll see you on the next one.